There is a button that says recording, so there we go. All right, there you go. All right. Well, I will say, so thank you all, PMI, Northern Nevada members and visitors and friends. Very much appreciate everyone taking an hour out of their day for our lunch and learn. This is obviously one very important way for us to give something back to the local Northern Nevada community of project management professionals, and just humbled to have some time with all of you. And I'm going to very quickly hand this over to Caitlin Klink, who is our speaker today. I say this about all of our lunch and learns other than perhaps my own, but this one in particular, Caitlin is a coworker of mine. I have the absolute pleasure and privilege of working with Caitlin. And what she's going to talk about today is not theoretical. This is not just a PowerPoint being read to you. I've been doing this work for way too long. And in the few years that I've worked with Caitlin, I've learned more about effective ways to communicate, choosing the right tool to communicate most effectively with the human beings that comprise our teams. So tooling is a lot of what she'll talk about, but it's really more about how to use those tools and techniques for the best way to interact with other human beings. I learned so much by this, and I'm just honored. Caitlin, thank you for accepting the invitation to join our community today. I adore this chapter. You will not find a group of individuals who is more committed to improving their craft. And I'm honored to be part of that as well. So with no further ado, thank you again, Caitlin, for making the time today.
No pressure. With quite a lead in. Thank you, John. I appreciate that. I learned from John daily. He's too humble to say that, but he is an amazing resource full of information, and I learn from him every single day. Is there a hand up? I just want to double check or is that just like a hello? Okay, cool. Hello. Okay, so we're here today to talk about collaboration, but maybe in a slightly different way than you're used to. If you have a particular baseline thumping through your brain right now, that's on purpose, but this talk is not about vanilla ice, regrettably. So if that's why you joined, no hard feelings if you want to drop. But the idea here is that we can collaborate with one another without stopping. And so what we're talking about here is leveraging asynchronous communication patterns to help improve our collaboration and productivity. So quick little sort of housekeeping. I don't know that we'll have enough time at the end today to talk through questions or skepticisms or doubts or whatever may arise within you during our time together. This QR code takes you to a form that will help you connect with me or with somebody at my company after this talk. If something I say resonates with you, or if you want to disagree with me passionately about something that I'm saying, I like that a lot too. So this is a great way to connect. I'll also put a link to this form in the chat. So if you'd like to kind of connect afterwards, I would love to chat through. We have a lot of different resources available that I can connect you with in terms of like how to implement some of the things we're going to talk about today. So I'll have this up at the end as well, but just wanted to call that out. So today we're going to talk about what it means to be asynchronous, why it's helpful, but mostly we'll spend time in how we do it. Like John said, my goal for you is to leave here with some tactical, actionable things that you can implement in your day-to-day, and to help sort of move the needle towards a more asynchronous communication patterns within your teams. As John said, my name is Caitlin Klink. I work for a really small startup. We're based in Richmond. We're a consultancy, but we are scattered all over the country. So most of our communication happens asynchronously. The things I'm going to talk about today are things that we leverage across our company, and that we also use with our clients and our partners, our other consultancies that we work alongside. So a lot of this is tried and true. It's not theory. It's things that you can put in practice right away. So to start off, I always find it helpful to sort of define our terms to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. And so what is asynchronous communication? What it's not is remote. A lot of times, these two terms get conflated and used interchangeably. And while there is a pretty big centerpiece to that Venn diagram, they are not the same thing. Asynchronous is not just remote. by another name. What it is, it's the exchange of information without the requirement for participants to be present and or engaged at the same time. So think like phone call, that's sort of ultimate synchronous communication, whereas email might be more asynchronous. And this type of communication and collaboration is marked by some key characteristics. So a lot of what we're going to do today is sort of unpack maybe preconceived notions that you have around these characteristics, and maybe sort of unearth some bias we have against some of these things. So the first of which is delayed response. And we see that, and we may immediately think, okay, that's a negative. It doesn't necessarily have to be. And my hope is that by the end of our time together, I have convinced you a little bit that delayed response can actually be a really positive thing. Another key characteristic that asynchronous communication offers us is flexibility. This is going to take a lot of different forms, and we'll talk about sort of how asynchronous collaboration can give us flexibility, maybe in ways that we hadn't thought of before. And then this last one is sort of a happy accident, a happy byproduct of leveraging asynchronous collaboration, and that's documentation. Because by nature of this type of collaboration, it tends to take the form of written communication. So inherently, we have a documentation of the exchange of ideas and comments that we've had through this collaboration, because we're not exchanging back and forth words verbally expressed. So a lot of you are probably already doing it anyways. So by like show of hand or an emoji thumbs up, can you just give me a sense of what we have in the room in terms of, are you all already sort of leveraging asynchronous communication or collaboration in some way? Okay, great. I see a lot of thumbs up. Certainly like email, right? Email is the OG of asynchronous collaboration. I think over the last few decades, we've tried to find a lot of ways to communicate with each other other than email, but we sort of true back to it. I'm at one client, I've worked with one client that said, we actually don't use email at all. I'm like, oh, that's pretty alarming. I think there's always a place for email. But certainly email is a good example of asynchronous communication. And we'll talk about a lot of other ones, but you're probably already doing this. So this isn't brand new. This isn't meant to sort of like give you this earth-shattering revelation. It's more meant to call out the places where we can sort of thoughtfully adjust some of the things we're already doing to sort of free up a little bit more time in our day to collaborate in a little bit more of an intentional way with one another, and ultimately to be a little bit more respectful of one another's time. So who can do this? Always the answer that comes to mind is remote teams do asynchronous, but really the answer is all teams. It's great for remote teams for obvious reasons. We're not in the same space where we can walk down the hall and have a conversation, but it's just as valuable and powerful for in-office teams, for teams that are distributed globally, for leadership and executive teams, product teams, development teams, any team, okay, your team. So anyone can leverage this, and anyone can start to embrace these strategies regardless of sort of where you are in your journey. Why should we do this? I was an English teacher a few lifetimes ago, and I'll talk a lot about mnemonic devices, but honestly, at its core, asynchronous collaboration represents like sort of the next paradigm shift. Remote work is obviously like not new. Some of us, woefully embraced it several years ago due to a large global event we all experienced together. Some of us skipped gleefully into that new reality. And some of us are having the idea of remote work slowly peeled out of our clenched fists as we speak. But the reality is that beyond remote is asynchronous. And it's sort of what underpins the power of remote work and really can get after like maximizing the potential of all teams. And we're going to talk about how that happens and how we can make that happen for ourselves in the next several minutes here. So asynchronous collaboration offers us two F's. There's sort of like two F's to think about here: flexibility and focus. And so first, what do we have? How does it give us flexibility? It definitely gives us flexibility in our schedule. And so if you have your bingo card, buzzword bingo card ready, you can go ahead and check off work-life balance. I said it here in 10 minutes in. So it improves our work-life balance. And I know it sounds like kind of silly, but the reality is that at N-Dash, and I think at a lot of organizations, we believe that you're your whole person at work. And so the happier that person is at work, sort of the more productive and happier work that you produce. So it's a little bit difficult to volunteer at your kid's school, or take a hot yoga class, or take your dog for a walk, or go to a lunch and learn when you have meetings all day long every day. And so learning how to embrace asynchronous collaboration patterns to start to move some of the work that happens in meetings out of meetings and into like asynchronous collaboration patterns can help to improve the freedom and the flexibility for your teams, and can start to improve this balance and lets people sort of define it for themselves. You may be thinking like, I'm in an organization where that's like not tenable, and that may be the case, but this starts to help us understand the why. Like, why do we want to do this? Because it allows us to start to think a little bit more about how we want to spend our day, and in what portions of our day should we be working in a meeting synchronously, and what portion of our day should we be heads down, and what portion of our day should we be sort of free from our computers. It also gives us the opportunity to designate times within the day that are for focus, and times throughout the day that are for synchronous collaboration. I think a big misnomer when people hear asynchronous is they think those people just don't want to have any meetings and just want to they just want to sit by themselves and not talk to anybody all day. And that's not really the case. The point here is that by being thoughtful about how we collaborate and using synchronous collaboration as one of many ways to collaborate, and not versus like the only way to collaborate. So by embracing synchronous collaboration patterns, we're able to start to carve out portions of our day where we're able to be like heads down and focused on a single task. It also gives us flexibility in location. So certainly this first one is a no-brainer. We have the ability to support teams that are working across time zones. I don't know why my Teams is going off. I definitely silenced it. That is unfortunate. I'm going to try to close out of that. There we go. Supports teams across time zones. It also allows us to work where productivity and creativity are maximized. So an example of this is like, if I'm a designer and I'm working on Figma mockups for a new website, and I want to sit somewhere where my creativity is maximized, maybe I want to sit and look at water or be outside in the sunlight. If I know I have 2 hours where I won't be sort of interrupted with a request to have synchronous collaboration, I can maybe move my workstation from inside in my home office to outside. Or if maybe I want to go out and sort of observe people while I'm working, maybe I work at a Starbucks for a morning if I know that I'm going to be heads down. Those scenarios are not like ideal for an executive readout, or maybe not for stand-up. But if I know that there are times within my day where I can predict the needs that my team will have of me, then I can maybe make that decision for myself. So that predictability, when we have rules around synchronous collaboration norms, that predictability gives me the flexibility to move somewhere where I might be able to work better. And this last one is probably the one that people think about least, which is flexibility and contributions. One of the places that I'm working presently, there is the shared express language is not a given. So there's a lot of people who speak English as maybe a second or third language. And so that fluency can really kind of create hiccups in real-time synchronous communication. Sometimes when we move some of that collaboration to asynchronous mediums, we find that we hear from folks who rarely come off mute in a meeting. We hear from them with much more frequency and with much more depth when we give them the time and space to be able to write out their thoughts and collaborate that way. So it's a little bit more inclusive for those who may be more hesitant to participate in real-time settings. And this also goes for folks who maybe are neurodivergent in some way. It sort of allows for a more diverse collection of ideas and opinions. And we know that diversity of thought is a real value driver in organizations. And so creating a space for folks to contribute in a way that they're most comfortable is a really kind of thoughtful and inclusive way to make sure that we are hearing all the voices in the room, or the Zoom, depending. So flexibility in in how our days look, where we spend our days, and who we hear from. And then focus. So we were joking a little bit about multitasking earlier. There's all kinds of science around reduced context switching. I have very impassioned exchanges with my coworkers about this because I like to think I'm really good at multitasking. They tell me that no one is good at multitasking. I've had to embrace the science and recognize that our brains can only do one thing at a time. So if we are doing more than one thing at a time, we're likely not doing it well. I see David is a big
multitasking is not a pleasant way of saying I'm not paying attention to you.
Yes, that's true. That's very true. That's very
There
true.
is no such thing. There
is no such thing. Nick would agree with you wholeheartedly.
Thank you, Nick.
What our brain does, right, in those moments is it just rapidly switching back and forth between two demands that we have on it, which means that neither of those demands is being met fully. I saw a joke the other day that said, "You want my undivided attention." Not even I get my undivided attention. That's asking a lot. But when we're multitasking, we just exacerbate that problem even further. So having time that we know we can be heads down, because some of that real-time collaboration has been moved to an asynchronous pattern, allows us sort of the freedom to not do this, to not engage in multitasking, to really be present in those synchronous meeting moments, because we know we'll have time later to do that thing that is also nagging on the back of our mind as well. It also allows us to, when we're focused on the thing that was nagging in our mind, it allows us to do that thing in a more creative and potentially more innovative way. We end up being better at the one thing when we're just doing the one thing. So sort of breaking the requirement for every single thing to be handled in real-time communication gives us this ability to really be present in those meetings, and then also really be present in creating the training that we're writing, or committing the code or reviewing the pull request, whatever the case may be, right? Like, it allows us to really focus on that thing and do that thing in our best way. It also gives us focus for responses. Certainly, it looks like we have a lot of impassioned people on this call, and I'm sure that those impassioned people have had moments of tension at work, which certainly never John, but others I might have had that experience. And that happens when you care deeply about things, right? I hate the expression it's not personal, it's work. Work is very personal. It's very much of our core piece of who we identify at and what our identity is. And so we tend to get very passionate about things at work. Dealing with things and having norms around how we solve problems or think critically or create artifacts in an asynchronous manner allows for a space for thoughtful and researched responses. Sometimes in the heat of the moment, we say things that maybe we wouldn't normally say that might just actually be not true. And so by moving some of our collaboration and some of our exchanges to asynchronous mediums and asynchronous methodologies, we create space for thoughtful and researched responses. Okay, now we're getting into sort of the nuts and bolts here. That's all well and good. How do we do it? And if you don't think that's all well and good, that's fine. I want to talk to you more about why you think it's not a good way to be. But more importantly, I want you all to have some real tactical things that you can implement right away. So how do we go about doing this? We're going to talk about several M's here. We're going to talk about messaging, meetings, mindset, and making it natural. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about is at the individual level, but I do want to mention that it's really difficult for one person to just decide overnight, okay, I'm just going to collaborate asynchronously now. It's great if that's how you feel, but in order to do it successfully, you do need to sort of work with the people around you to put some infrastructure in place to support that. So that's going to be kind of a common thread through this. We'll talk about how you can do it as an individual, and also how a team can start to move the needle to embrace it, because you really need the team to make this stuff work. So we're going to start with messaging, because I think it's probably the most pervasive tool that exists in our work life. Maybe that wasn't true several years ago, but it definitely feels true now. So really quickly, before I dive in here, can you guys put in the chat, what tool or tools are you using to message your teammates? So not emails, but messaging tools. So put in there whatever you're doing. I see Teams Or if you're using more than one, I've been in a client recently that uses Slack and Teams in the same organization. The business uses Slack, IT uses Teams. That's a jolly adventure and a half, and none of them have any rules. Okay, Slack and Teams pretty much ubiquitously. Okay, cool. So depending on how old everyone is here, you may or may not remember AOL Instant Messenger, but I think I can confidently say we all remember that. Maybe a lot of us remember getting the CD in the mail, right? That was instant messaging. We would get the CD, we would put it in for our free minutes, we'd dial up. When we logged in and our light was green, we would message with our friends, real time, instant. I'm not sure if that's the reason why, as adults, we all sort of treat Slack and Teams like it's AOL instant messaging, but it is not instant messaging. And I really, truly believe that messaging tools in the absence of norms and guardrails is like the worst of all types of communication patterns out there. And I believe that with simple changes in how we use these tools, we can really start to experience some amazing impacts and amazing improvements on how our day is spent. So we're going to have a little story time here. What does it feel like today? So real-time messaging, the sender feels the need to start with like a good morning or hello exclamation point. How are you? Right? We have this pressure to like engage as though it's a phone call, pleasantries. There's also this expectation of immediate response. That is typically because we're thinking of these as instant messaging tools. So if I ping John, I'm expecting him to respond to me immediately because I need him immediately. That's why I pinged him immediately. And it's not like a nefarious intent, but the thing is that we don't have any real, if we don't have any guidelines or norms about how to use these tools, we tend to sort of just like place our own preconceived notions on them. And so when we send that message, unless there's like already rules established, you don't really have any visibility into the receiver's current status. They may be read, but maybe they're always read. They may be on do not disturb, but maybe they're always on do not disturb, or they're always away. Those, unless we've like set as a team, like this is what away means, this is what do not disturb means. Like we don't really necessarily know the mindset or the current like status of that person. And that person receiving the message is part of the problem as well, right? How many have you ever gotten that like hello, and then you just wait for like the dots of doom just kind of like are there waiting, and you're waiting to hear what they want to say. And while you're sitting there waiting, you've navigated away from another task, probably because your notifications are likely on, and you're sitting there frustrated, like, what do you want? What do you want? What do you want? Tell me what you want. And that's partly our fault because we reacted immediately to the notification. And so we're just waiting for their request. That's a little bit on us. But we do that because there's no like clear guidance not to. We feel pressure to respond immediately because no one has said we don't have to. In the world we live in, right, everything is increasingly like, what's the deadline? As soon as possible. How much can you do? Do more than that. So we sort of live in that culture. And so that feeds into this need to like immediately respond when we get that little ding or across our desktop, right? So we feel annoyed at the intrusion. Maybe the level of the person messaging us helps dictate how frustrated and annoyed we are. And maybe how much we have to do also feeds into that as well. But everything feels urgent because we haven't really decided what is urgent and what is not. Is there a better way? How do we make it better? So we can think about this in two sides. So when we're sending messages, how do we reach out to teammates who are focused? So one thing that we can do is we can schedule messages to send at a later point in time. If 10 o'clock is your most productive hour of the day, that's great. And you should definitely work that most productive hour for yourself. You, however, might want to send any Slack messages, schedule them to be sent tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. or at 9 a.m., whenever your team tends to start work. That's a really easy way to sort of be a little bit more respectful about reaching out to teammates at inordinate hours. Or if somebody is on do not disturb and they've been kind enough to let you know that they are heads down until 2 p.m., you can maybe schedule your message to send at 2 p.m. As a team, this is where the team comes in. You can sort of set norms for response times. In stand-up, you can say, hey, just remember, like we've decided we're going to be heads down at a certain point in the day. So response times might be slower, things like that. So it's sometimes it's just as simple as like calling it out and being intentional about the fact that like we're not responding right away. I saw a really cool byline on an email recently that said, I sent this at a time that was convenient for me. Please respond at a time that's convenient for you. And just that simple call out reminded me, the recipient, like, okay, she sent this at 1 a.m., but that doesn't mean I have to respond by 7:30 in the morning. It just means that like, that's when it was convenient for her. And it just means that she wants my thoughts. So when you start to do that, you start to chip away at that very deeply ingrained sense that everything is urgent, because I believe very much that we live in that world, and it takes a lot of reminders to sort of jolt us out of that, to remember like not all of the things are on fire all the time. So you don't have to treat everything like an emergency. However, sometimes there are emergencies. So how do you indicate the urgency of a communication? You can do things like you can preface your messages with "for decision." That's a great way to call out the fact that, hey, I need you to pay attention to this and I need you to respond, or something along the lines of like, "for your situational awareness." That lets the recipient know, like, I'm just informing you, you don't have an action here. You can use emojis. I know not everybody like loves emojis, but I have news for you. Like, they're not going away. They're very much here to stay. My 11-year-old communications look like hieroglyphics. So they're here. They're here to stay. So you could use like a flashing light to let people know that that's an urgent communication. You could use the word urgent. So there are a lot of ways to sort of call out the things that are urgent, and that way, when you know some things are urgent, you know that other things are not. When you are the recipient on the receiving end of these messages, there are some things that you can do to set up some boundaries around when you're unavailable. So establishing unavailable hours. One thing you can do, this is again the team part. So you can have a standard heads down period within the team. And this is when I talk about this is a place where people typically say like, oh, there's no way that we could do that at our organization. It's too big and there's too many. So I worked at a really big bank, and within each agile release train, the groups decided developers were going to have heads down time from 1 to 4 every day. Those were the core hour times. Now, there was some sanctity to that. And so what we did is we really tried hard not to schedule team meetings within that time. That was the time for the engineers to be heads down. And so it doesn't have to be like organizationally wide, but as within your teams, as best you can start to try to protect little periods of time within the day where there's like an established understanding and practice that like we don't schedule meetings and we maybe don't message each other. And this can be difficult, especially if you're working with a team that has any type of like externally facing support or any type of SLAs around incident response times, things like that. And the way you solve that is you rotate external facing channel coverage. So like maybe we have a Slack channel where users can raise emergencies, and that Slack channel needs to be responded to within like an hour. So maybe Monday is my day to cover that Slack channel, and so I don't get focus time on Monday, but then John takes over on Tuesday and I get focus time, and we take turns as a team sort of rotating the coverage. I've been on teams that sort of do that they do it. It's a dual track agile team. So during the discovery phase, like there's an AMS engineer that covers the incident desk every sprint, and they decided at sprint planning, and then they just rotate that responsibility. So there are ways to sort of protect that coverage or that asynchronous time, even if there is always a on-call feature of the team. Again, these tools that we're already using, a lot of them have do not disturb settings, and maybe it's as simple as saying like away means I'm actually not at my desk. Do not disturb means I'm there and I'm actually working, and please don't bother me. And red means that I'm in a meeting. So there are a lot of different ways to just sort of leverage the out of the box features that these tools have to help you like sort of just say like, hey, I'm not available. Because that's really what this is all about. It's all about just carving out a little bit of time to say like, I'm focused on a task, and like this thing I'm working on by myself, and I need heads down time. That's what all of this is about. And so again, like be thoughtful about how you use them. The away feature is great because I think Teams, you can do it on Teams and Slack now, where you can put on your away message like where you are and what you're doing. So you could say like out for a walk, returning at 2 p.m. or heads down until 3. We'll be responding to messages after, things like that. So you can give people hope. If you're always away, like people will message you all the time, but you have to give people hope that you're coming back and you'll respond to them. So be very transparent about that. Keep that in your mind. You might be sitting there thinking like, there's no way I'm telling my organization that I'm going for a walk at 1 o'clock. Like I'm not sharing that information, because a lot of times that information can be weaponized against folks. So keep that in mind when we talk about mindset. That's kind of what I mean about the infrastructure piece. You sometimes need a little bit of support around these practices, especially when you're asking people to be transparent and trusting them to be like productive adults, and not, sort of monitoring their every movement. So what that moves us to, I'm going to kind of go through these a little bit quickly, is a world in which senders are sending clear and concise communication, where the thing that I need from you is in that first message. I'm not sending like an emotional grenade to say like, do you have time to give me your unavailable attention right this moment? Good morning. I'm saying like, hey, when you get a chance, and I'm very clear about what I'm asking for. I'm going to prioritize, and I'm only going to use the messaging tool for the things that we agreed would go in the messaging tool. So when we talk a little bit more about like how to implement this on a whole team, part of it is like, okay, well, we're going to use Slack for this type of collaboration. We're going to use Google Docs for this type of communication. We're going to use email for this type of communication. So it can be as simple as saying like, how are we using the tools that we have available to us? So I'm going to prioritize and only put the things in Slack and Teams that really need to go there. I'm going to be really clear about how urgent something is. If I have an ask and it's urgent, I'm going to be clear about that in the beginning. And I'm also going to ultimately respect receivers' response times. You may put on your team that like urgent, if it's urgent, I'm calling you. And that if you get a phone call from me, that means it's urgent. Although quick disclaimer, like younger generations aren't going to answer the phone no matter how urgent it is, because they don't, not all of them like use that feature of their cell phone. So just be aware of that if you're doing direct calls. As receivers of messages, we have a big role in this as well. Just like we're part of the existing problem, we have a big role in solving that problem. And one is managing expectations. So if you are responding to Slack messages at 7:30 in the evening or 10 o'clock at night, you are letting people know that you're available to respond to Slack messages at 10 o'clock at night. So manage the expectations of when you're available for messages. Respond clearly, and make sure that you are adhering to those documented team norms. A lot of this is about taking the time to set the norms on the team and say like, this is how we're going to leverage synchronous communication, and this is how we're going to leverage asynchronous communication, and then adhering to what it is that we say. That's the infrastructure piece. So in the example I mentioned earlier with the engineers, like they sort of had the power and the autonomy to say like, I didn't respond to you because it was during heads downtime and it wasn't an emergency. And so like, that's our established team norm. And that's why I didn't respond. And that comes into like documenting those practices to make sure that everybody's on the same page about how they work. Now, granted, there are exceptions to this, obviously. Like if the president calls you and they need you, like that's a call you answer. If they schedule a meeting with you at 5:30, like that's a meeting you go to. So there are exceptions to this, obviously. Again, it's not all or nothing. It's about slowly starting to put some of these things in place and maybe just picking one thing and saying like, okay, we're going to do this on the team to start. Sort of as a whole team, things that you can do. Until Teams and Slack change their pricing structure, channels and conversations are free. So spin them up, burn them down, like use them at your will. They're a great way to organize conversation. When COVID first hit, right, remember everybody had like the cooking channel and the water cooler channel and the people who like to, knit channel. We had all these different channels. You can do that for work as well. One of my favorite challenges to asynchronous was somebody that I was working with who's a QA tester, and he was like, there's just no way you can do testing asynchronously. Like there has to be an exchange with the developer. There's no way to do this if you're testing complex features. And so I respectfully disagreed with that. And my suggestion there is like, if you're releasing 3 features, maybe each feature gets a channel. The developer can put in that feature, or in that channel rather, this is what I've developed, and like the test cases can go there. And maybe like through asynchronous communication, you have dealt with like 90% of the functionality, and you pull up for 15 minutes to talk through that last gnarly 10% of code to figure out, why isn't it behaving as expected. Threads are another really great tool. Slack uses threads, Microsoft Teams uses conversations, but threads to keep exchanges grouped and easier to find later. At Ndash, like my direct messages with Nick are just single lines of text with like 30 messages threaded. So it'd be something like, today, holiday party plans. And then like underneath are like 30 messages about all the planning back and forth, or like, new client conversation. And again, everything goes underneath there. So threading is a great way to keep exchanges grouped and easy to find. And you can just kind of like make it fun and say like, hey, we're going to use threads. And if people don't use threads, you can respond with like an angry thread emoji and say, make sure you thread. Can't imagine who I'm talking about there. Use emojis to represent actions or reactions. So you can use emojis to say like, hey, there's no agenda for this meeting today. Does anybody have any items? Can we cancel it? Yes, no. And then everybody just has to click a button and then we know, versus pulling up to meet and then saying, what are we going to meet about? And then whoever is most senior on that call saying, while I have you all here, that is like, nature abhors a vacuum. So that hour-long meeting that could have been canceled, suddenly it's taken 90 minutes. And then this one feels like a no-brainer, but long paragraphs are not conducive to messaging apps. So if you have a lot of information to convey and you really want to use a messaging app, use the formatting tools, use a bulleted list. I love a numbered list. If I need like action on 5 different things, I might post that as the message and then ask everyone to thread their responses. And by the end of the day, I have everything I need on those 5 items. And I never had to pull everyone together to talk through it. People were just able to give me their updates at their leisure. All right, that's messaging apps. Next is meetings. So meetings are a big one. If you could really quickly put in the chat, what's the average amount of time you spend in meetings during each day? If you had to average it, go and put in the chat. What do we got? 45 minutes, hours, 4 hours, 4 to 5. Let's see, what do we got? 4 hours of meeting. That's a half the day, 1.5. That's great. 4 to 5. That's over half. And don't you love it when people say, well, I was in meetings all day. I didn't get any work done. I hate that. Meetings are sometimes more work, actually usually more work. Dealing with other people is very cognitively taxing. So meetings are oftentimes more work than asynchronous. If you're down to 2 or 3, that's awesome. That's great. But for those of us that are encroaching in that like 50% or more space, it really tends to be disruptive, because it's not like those meetings are like 9 to noon, right? It's like maybe you have 2 or 3 15-minute to 30-minute breaks within the course of the day. Like that's not enough time to really get anything meaningful done. So meetings get a really bad rap, right? Mostly because they're really poorly used in a lot of organizations, and they're often really poorly run. I have a friend who likes to say that meetings are not inherently good or bad, but they're like money. It's how you spend them. It's what you do with them. So, when we think about meetings, like without asynchronous practices, we have these full calendars, we have burnout, we don't have time to focus. There's often decreased morale. There's nothing worse than coming home from vacation and looking at your calendar the next day. That's like the worst Sunday scaries ever. But when we start to think about like moving some of the stuff we do in meetings to asynchronous collaboration, we suddenly have more time for innovation, maybe hopefully increased motivation, because you have blocks of free time during the day. You have time to focus and have deep thought. And most importantly, asynchronous practices lead you to be able to have more productive meetings. What asynchronous practices do is they start to tell you, like they help you drive when you need a meeting versus when you can do it outside of the meeting. So in order to make meetings work better, some things that you can think about: send out the materials to review ahead of time. Encourage people to review those materials asynchronously rather than sitting all together reviewing a PowerPoint together. That's maybe, in my opinion, one of the worst types of meetings, where we're reviewing an artifact real time for the first time together. Send me that artifact ahead of time so that when we meet, we can spend meaningful time talking about the feedback rather than reviewing the artifact for the first time. Craft an agenda for invitee awareness. That seems like such a low bar, but I hope I'm not surprising anyone. Like, this is so not the norm at so many places. I just got a meeting put on my calendar for 5:30 tomorrow with just a title and 3 recipients. And I have to sort of piece together what's going to happen in that meeting and how hard I should push back at having a meeting that late in the day. And if an agenda feels too heavy, consider just setting a goal. Just start with a goal and then start the meeting with that goal. Today we are gathered to achieve X. And that way everybody sort of knows why we're there together. It's also very helpful to provide that ahead of time so that people can prepare before the meeting to be a part of that meeting. So meetings with goals and giving people a little bit of heads up so that they can spend some asynchronous time preparing can make those minutes that we spend together that much more productive. And then lastly, like, please schedule meetings within the boundaries decided on by your team. If you decided that you're going to have heads down time and then you schedule a meeting in the middle of that, that's a clear violation of the team norm. So sort of reinforce that idea of having focus time by scheduling meetings within the boundaries that the team has set. The other really helpful thing here is the optional attendee feature. So when you're inviting participants, if you don't need everyone there, make them optional. Don't make the decision makers optional just because their calendar is the busiest. You can't do that. But make the people who don't need to be there optional. And that way that helps the attendees make a decision about whether or not they should come or whether or not they're needed to come. And then lastly, document the decisions and highlights for team awareness. So there's nothing worse than having a meeting and then having somebody schedule a meeting to catch you up on the meeting that they missed, right? That's like double, triple negatives. So instead of that, document the decisions and send them out. Hey, we met today. This is where we landed. These are the action items. This is when the follow-up is. Microsoft Teams is really great for this because every meeting has that persistent chat. So that lets the optional attendees who maybe didn't come sort of get the highlights of what happened during that meeting. So it's a very like quick thing that you can do right after the fact. I'm sure there are a lot of AI tools out there as well that will actually just like do this for you. Check them, obviously, those meeting minutes before you send them out to everyone. But definitely this is another way that you can sort of just keep everybody in the loop without requiring everybody to be there all the time. It also starts to build trust so that people who are optional and are super busy and like aren't necessarily needed, they trust that the work is happening and that they don't have to be there for the work to happen. So that's another really great way to start to help free up other people's time as well. There's a little bit of things that you can do, or so just if we think about this, like as we're scheduling a meeting, like in practice. So beforehand, define your agenda, share the artifacts. During, if people aren't reviewing the artifacts ahead of time, try spending the first 10 minutes in silence, having everyone review the artifact. That will start to really quickly make people review the artifacts before they come. Not like in an embarrassing, shameful way, but just really lighthearted. Like, hey, before we review, take 10 minutes and let's everybody do heads down if everyone doesn't have feedback. That will start to change things quickly. This can be a role that floats, right? You can have somebody sort of scribe the decisions made. It doesn't have to be the same person all the time, although often it will probably be the person who called the meeting will document the decisions made, but it doesn't have to be. You can make this a floating responsibility. And then afterwards, publish those action items and decisions for visibility and transparency, like right away. And then if needed, just set the agenda and the meeting invite for the follow-up meeting so that everybody knows like this is when we'll be following up on these items, and they sort of have that plan so that they can use their asynchronous time in between meetings to get that work done, and they're not multitasking during your meeting, frantically trying to do the thing that you assigned them 6 weeks ago. And so what all of this kind of put together does is it starts to build trust that like we don't have to be together in the same room for work to get done, because that ultimately is why people schedule a meeting. They want to know, they want to watch you do the work. They want to watch you receive the information to make sure that you understand, to make sure that it's going to get done. So being able to start to show that like we can do this work separately, we can do this work asynchronously, and then come together and spend really meaningful synchronous focus time on getting the work over the finish line. It's kind of a balance of both of those things. The pendulum has sort of shifted really far away from the idea of doing independent work to everything needs a meeting. So what we're doing here is we're trying to shift that pendulum back the other way. So probably the most important thing is mindset, as with everything, right? So when you're doing this, grow gradually. This can be really sort of like uncomfortable for folks. So recognize that and explore freely without concern for correctness. Don't worry if you don't get it right the first time. Try something out, try one strategy that we've talked about today, and then reflect and see if it worked, and then change it if it needs to be changed. So this doesn't have to be all at once. Educate people on the benefits. Start with the why, right? Really hammer home those ideas of like the flexibility that it offers, the ability to focus that it offers, and then really start to set those clear expectations. So this is where the empathy piece comes in. If you want people to be transparent about where they are and when they're coming back, you really can't weaponize that date. You know, you can't be like, oh, so-and-so's at Starbucks again, right? That can't be the culture if you're asking people to be transparent about where they're working and when they're available for synchronous collaboration. Learn from successes and failures. I coach youth basketball, so we learn a lot from failures, but you can also learn a lot from success, right? Where there are things that are working, create a space for people to share out those successes, because that's a great way to start to shift culture, is by showing, hey, there's benefit in working this way. This is what I learned. Why don't you try it? People, that resonates a lot more than sometimes top-down initiatives can. How do you do this on a team? Start by like a kickoff where you pull together like an effort for your team to do this, go through the benefits, talk about the need for an open mind, and next steps. Those next steps will often be like a team norms. I'm going to, right at the end here, I'll share, NDAS just released a bunch of Miro templates. We have a template that's free and out there for how to set asynchronous team norms. So that's like a way you might have do team norms sessions within your teams. You can do a session just on how are we going to leverage asynchronous practices within our team. So I'll provide that resource here at the end. But just think about like have your team start to think about how can asynchronous collaboration work for them. And then it doesn't have to be a one size fits all. It could be like this team decided they're going to have like 2 hours of heads down time. This other team is going to do it a slightly different way. They're going to use Slack statuses to let everybody know when they're available for synchronous communication. So sort of let teams choose their own adventure when and where you can, when and where it makes sense. And then start to think about tooling. This doesn't mean like go to leadership and say, we need new tools for asynchronous communication. I need $1 million. That's not what you need to, you don't need to do that. But you could say like, hey, we're going to use email to communicate out action items. We're going to use Google Docs to collaborate. We're going to use Miro for planning. We're going to use Jira for work visualization, and then just sort of set the rules. This is how we use Slack. This is how we use email, and start with the tools that you already use. You may also need to do some training, and depending on the level of psychological safety, folks may not know how to use the tools the way that you, these happy practices that you guys decide upon, and they're likely not going to say, I don't know how to use the tool we've been using for 2 years. So you might just need to sort of make some how-tos available for like, this is how you use an emoji reaction, or this is how you collaborate in a Google Doc, or this is the way that you can leverage Teams channels. This is how you turn on notifications or turn them off, things like that. And then lastly, like most importantly, how do you make this last? Because you want this to live on past your time, right? Or past your implementation of it. Leadership engagement, as with everything, is important. If you can find a champion of this at the leadership level, that's incredibly helpful. Someone that will sort of like reinforce this idea. Stay out of the way and let this thing sort of grow organically. Regularly collect feedback. This could be a Slack channel for people to share practices or talk about how it's going. It could be a retro at the teams level. It could be an email inbox. There's a lot of ways, but create space for people to give feedback about how it's going, because it's something new. So that's very important. Encourage people to share their experiences. Maybe you can highlight asynchronous like stars and asynchronous practices that teams are doing, and give teams a little bit of shine for the way that they are like embracing this new way of working. And then lastly, like talk about it. It may sound like really counterintuitive to like talk about like meeting to talk about not meeting, but the gains that you get by taking synchronous time to define that asynchronous behavior is by design like a compounding impact on productivity. So when I talk to people about working this way, they struggle with how to scale it. That often seems to be the question. So just remember, this is an example of a culture shift. It's just a different way to think about how we work together. So gradual is good. It can be as simple as setting a no hello norm on your team to as complex as like cutting your calendar in half and only allowing meetings in the morning. There's no one size fits all. And it's really just a matter of like surveying the landscape, pinpointing places where you can start to shift the needle and implement some of these strategies, and really just kind of like doing your best and meeting people where they are. And that's really like all I have for you guys. I would love to connect and chat more. It looks like we have maybe like 8 minutes for questions. There's that QR code again. I put our blog up here that has a lot of these tools and tricks that are specific. Thank you, Nick, for the norms, the Miro workshop norms. If you can't open that, if you open Miro and just search asynchronous, you'll see the one by N-Dash. And then also, like, if you look at these 2 books, Remote and Rework, I really recommend them. They sort of help you reconceptualize how we do work and think a little bit differently about how we work together in teams. And then I think that's all. We have a couple minutes for questions.
Caitlin, thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys for joining.
Truly engaging, and wow, I learned stuff, and it's hard
Great.
for me to do that.
Against your will.
Against my will. Thank you, John.
Wonderful. I'm glad to hear it.
I threw your LinkedIn in the chat earlier as well.
Very much. Awesome.
Any questions for Caitlin from anybody?
Or vehement disagreement, that's fine too.
Yeah, agreement. There was a lot of things that just make sense. And one of the things I've been driving in our organization is, if you have a meeting, you have an outcome. Let us know what the ask is first. And
yeah,
I put in the chat there, I really did have to explain what an agenda was for.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's that level of not understanding.
Yeah. Even after you've explained it, that level exists.
I like to think of myself as a pretty good communicator. But anyway, John Thompson has his hand up.
Yeah, I had a quick question in regards to asynchronous communication using the Teams groups. And then what I've done in my Six Sigma projects have been consistently loading docs and commuting almost solely through that, outside of direct emails, or sending out Teams texting. But mostly I'm driving almost all of my communication, at least through asynchronous, outside of collaboration meetings, through that Teams channel, where I upload, recordings, the actual outline of a meeting, as well as any documentation. So I just wondered if that's in line with what you're kind of suggesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's it. And, I think that the next step in that is trying to do some of that collaboration asynchronously as well. So as if you put a document up there and the idea is that you collaborate on it, that you sort of ask for that feedback ahead of time, or ask people to come with their comments ready, or things of that nature. So like, I think that's absolutely in line with what we're talking about. It's like, it's not don't ever meet, but it's do that work ahead of time so that the time together is that much more productive, right? I'm sure you've been on meetings where you're like, how much is this costing all these people here together?
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Last question I wanted to ask, in your consulting experience, have you ever worked with Six Sigma teams that do not lean, but actual full-blown demerit projects, where I've thought about, listening to what you said about asynchronous? Most of when I do a project, it's very collaborative. It's definitely in real time. I'm using spreadsheets or whiteboards online because my teams are so, spread across the country, if not in Europe and places like that.
Mm-hmm. I haven't directly worked with teams like that, but what I will say is that like the idea of using whiteboards asynchronously is something that, like Nick and I, for example, do all the time for our like internal projects. If we're working on clients, we rarely meet, maybe like 15 minutes a week do we meet. So what we do is we sort of leave comments for one another in that whiteboard space, where we can sort of just kind of pick up where one another leaves off. For things that aren't super time sensitive, that works really well. But if it is time sensitive, you can set sort of like expectations around response times and how frequently a team should be checking back into that whiteboard for like the next action.
Right. Okay. This was interested. I've been, brainstorming some ideas of how to incorporate more of that. Because a lot of the times, to what you said, you get 2 or 3 people talking in a meeting and 4 or 5 people don't. And I've been very cognizant. If I notice it's going really quiet, only one guy's talking, I'll go round robin around the room and says, does anybody else have any input, rather than just saying, this worth one person's answering all the questions.
Yeah.
And you can apply those same techniques. So I think the Six Sigma stuff, and I do have some experience with working with teams like that. But the stuff that Caitlin was talking about, to me is immutable, right? So whether it's Six Sigma or anything else, the concepts still are what I think Caitlin had alluded to. Does this require real-time collaboration? And that's a question to ask about that context. But the idea is, even with Six Sigma, I mean, if we're looking at defects, if we're looking at whatever that data might be, the same idea, like I would want to see any sort of reporting in advance and let people have the ability to say, here's what I see in the data or what I didn't see in the data. Those same techniques allow for the ability of segmenting off something that can and should be done independently, and then unifying that later with something that is collaborative, but there's an order of operations. And what I think with a lot of these things is they get conflated and brought together. So I know that you're going deep in terms of the actual Lean Six Sigma specific, right. But I think those concepts really are immutable. It's not agile. It's not traditional. It's anything else. Thanks, everybody. I think we're at time, but yeah, Caitlin, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks on behalf of the chapter.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much. Thanks for having me, John. Thanks, Greg. Thanks.
Thank you for accepting the invitation.
Yeah.
Thank you. And thanks, Linda. Thanks,
Linda. Nice to meet you. Bye.
All right. Thanks, Caitlin.
Bye.
Bye.